podcast where theology fuels the mission of the church. We are about developing leaders to be equipped to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. Welcome to a milestone episode for us, number 10. We've talked about so far ideas of missional reflection, missional practice, missional rest, missional authority, a lot of the word missional. And today we celebrate our 10th episode in conversation with you, our listeners. That's right. It's our anticipated question and answer episode.
Woohoo!
Tyler's super excited about this. And it's good to be back. Good to be back in the studio today.
Always great to be back. Super happy to continue this conversation and get to number 10.
Excellent. And this especially feels well because we actually are able to be together in the studio because, Tyler, your family just recently had COVID.
Oh, my goodness. So not even just COVID. We had a week of kids with bad things that you don't want to hear on a podcast that resulted in one of our kids being hospitalized. And then right after we got back from the hospital, we got COVID. And it was like dominoes. One boy, another boy, another boy, a dad, a mom, and then we're out for 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate, right? And as you guys were dealing with some of the early stuff before you had COVID, my family also had COVID. So we all passed that around and we shared quarantine as well. And just to have a little bit of fun while we were in our apartment locked in, I dubbed our apartment Covidia. Just because it sounds like it's from a Marvel movie. And that's pretty much the only reason. But we had to have a little bit of fun somehow. But God was gracious to us. It's good to be back in the studio today, though. So we'll jump right in. We have multiple questions. We won't be able to answer all of them. But the first question I think that we'll go with is from Bulgaria. So Tyler, do you want to read that question for us and maybe we'll just dive right in?
I'm so excited. Thank you, Bulgaria, for your representation.
Excellent.
It's great. So here are the questions. There are actually two, and they're connected. The first question is, why is theology important for people of all ages? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, how can young people benefit from theological resources if they feel like education isn't for them?
And a lot of people do. That's also like a bonus question. So well done, Bulgaria. 2 questions, but they're both related, so it passes. It really is one question, but we'll treat it as 2 separate in part as well. It's an honor to have listeners in Bulgaria, so we do thank you. And before we answer the first question, I would like to say that my family and I recently made, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but we recently made banitsa, which is a traditional Bulgarian dish that some magazine has said it's like one of the best in the world.
And you guys made it at home.
We did.
Wow.
We got the recipe, and it's great. Bulgarian feta cheese layered between like phyllo dough and then butter all over the place. And then you pour a lovely mixture of egg and milk, which soaks in as the pastry's baking. It comes out excellent.
Oh my goodness.
Very good. It's in American language, English, yes. We call it comfort food. So soothing and good for the soul. And especially for our daughter's soul, because I'm pretty sure she ate more of it than any of us. And she just turned a year old in December.
Yes.
So she really enjoyed the Bulgarian food. But why is theology important for people of all ages? Tyler.
Let's get back to it. Well, just like Bulgarian, what was it called? Banitsa is good for people of all ages in your story.
Oh, amazing. Well done.
Thank you. So theology can nourish you at whatever stage of spiritual development you're at. Is that a good answer?
Oh, it's excellent.
Ooh, okay. I mean, I think that this is something that we all kind of assume is true, but actually, putting it into practice and seeing it be true is a little bit harder. We can all say, yeah, of course, learning about God at all stages of your life is important, but what difference does it really make? And I think we're going to get to this later, but there are different levels of theology. It doesn't mean that we're going through, like a 3,000 page systematic theology book with our 4-year-old boys. But
my son might actually like that.
He might like that. That's true. He has incredible patience for sitting and listening to
hours.
Books being read.
Yeah, he does.
That's really, really, really great. So what do you think?
Yeah, I like to use an analogy, mostly because it's in Scripture, and I use it a lot when I'm teaching, when I'm in class, and it's because Jesus liked boats. He spent a lot of time in boats, like a lot of time in boats, and so it's appropriate, I think, because of that. But if you picture a believer in a small, like, little kayak or a small individual boat, the surrounding water is rolling. It's ever changing. It's not a constant thing, and that those waves can represent cultural ideas. So the question is, how do you not get carried away in the drift of the water of cultural ideas? And I think the answer is that hopefully, maybe not in a kayak, that's not the best example, but a small boat should have an anchor. So if you use the anchor, then it helps to keep you stabilized, or at least stabilized long enough so you can figure out, like, the next move within the cultural milieu of all the waves. Like, where do I go next? How do I get back to shore? How do I engage well with this? So I always sort of jokingly but seriously ask to students, where is your anchor? Because theology is what we use to anchor ourselves in our unchanging God and in the gospel.
Yeah. If I could offer a counter illustration that might be where some of our listeners or maybe some of our listeners have heard or seen this kind of defense of why theology is important, is a contrasting illustration would be that theology is kind of the fortress that we hide in, you know, and that we've built up, and that's strong and it's safe. And so the way that we protect ourselves from the waves is we just kind of hide behind the walls. But that's not exactly what God has called us to do. He's called us to be on mission in the world, but anchored in the right things. And so that it's not about having all the right answers and having it all figured out. It's about being tethered to the right things so that you can respond when troubles come, so that you can speak the truth in a way that makes sense in a particular conversation with someone in the face of a particular challenge, with those waves, you know, coming up. So what do you think of that kind of a contrast?
That's excellent. And that really is the point, because the anchor is sort of what tethers us, to use your language there, back to God himself, and also back to orthodoxy, not capital O, but lowercase o, orthodoxy and church history. Like,
that's right. Yeah.
The tradition of faith that has been passed on to us, and we run that tether back and ultimately root it back into God. And so our anchor is really what allows us to move and stabilize, but we don't just hide behind the walls of the fortress as it is. Yeah. So that's a really good extra analogy. Yeah. The analogy, I think, shows that all believers need something that anchors them to God. Now that has to happen in appropriate ways, and I think in terms of in an explicit theological manner, Alister McGrath, a really good theologian, he's still teaching at Oxford, I believe. Yes. He puts it well in chapter 5 of his Christian Theology. In there, he talks about the idea of faith, and he notes that many creeds of the early church begin with. You gave it away. I did give it away. It was a weird slip of the tongue.
Freudian slip, yeah. Yes.
Of the early church begin with, I totally gave it away, so here it is. I believe in God, which nearly everybody recognizes probably.
Right.
I believe in God. And this is a huge statement that has many questions then that come from it.
That's right.
So those questions are essentially the study of theology, and boiling it really, really down, the study of God. So in Greek, if we break down theology, we have it coming from two words, from theos, God, and logos, word. So, or word about God. in this case, context. And McGrath recommend that book. It's a very good...
Yeah, we use it in our introductory theology module at Formation College.
Yeah, so I recommend that for a good read of development of theology. It's a very accessible text. Very, very intelligent guy, but very, very accessible book. So I recommend that for some of what we're saying now as a further resource. And I think it's also true that early theology was developed in a polytheistic environment. Tyler, do you want to describe what that means? Polytheistic environment?
Lots of gods.
Lots of gods.
Lots of gods. So, yeah, in contrast to monotheism, which recognizes that there are lots of spiritual beings, there are angels and demons, but there's only one supreme God.
Yeah. And so if we think in context of how theology was crafted, originally created through some of the creeds and the councils, in that type of an environment, we can see that theology actually has a missional bent to it, a forward-looking movement, but it's also not just forward for the sake of forward, it's anchored or tethered back to God. So it means that there were a number of other religions competing for what truth is back then, and it's just like today.
Right? Multiculturalism today, it bears in many ways where the church is today is more similar to the early centuries, first 3 centuries of the church, than the church at its height, where everybody was a Christian, which is not the case anymore. So one of the reasons why going back to those early years is really valuable as we learn how to tether ourselves in a world that doesn't recognize God as the one true God.
Yeah, and in talking about creeds and catechisms and councils and all of those things that people are like, well, I mean, they just want to snore and go to sleep because they can tend to be boring and somewhat abstract sometimes, but they were written very specifically to counter other truth claims in culture. And so because of that, they are actually living documents. And today they are just as alive. And by no means are they boring, because they actually shape and form our practice. So they outlined proper faith for the purpose of living rightly in a plural world. And right belief leads to right practice. We've talked about that on the podcast here before, with the concrete result of not bowing down to an idol like Israel to the golden calf, or dishonoring God in that way or others. And this is an aspect of the question of theology's meaning, I think, that we need to claim. That is, these early creeds, early things are not just for adults to learn.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's not just to collect dust in the church library.
And it's not something that we just subscribe to and say, yeah, we believe that, but let's move on either. That would be akin to throwing the anchor out of our boat and saying, great, it's in the water, but letting go of the rope.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So let's move into the next part of the question. How can young people, who's sort of where we just were, but how can young people benefit from theological resources if they feel like education, quote, isn't for them?
Right. I think there's a fear of getting overwhelmed. Theological education can seem like this massive, massive thing. And it is. Theology is massive, and learning about theology is a lifetime project.
At least.
It's actually, that's right. It's
the eternal project.
The eternal project. Yeah. And so I totally understand young people, particularly ministry bent young people might be thinking, that's great that some people are doing that. I just need to go and serve. And we've talked about that on previous podcasts, but maybe to the question, maybe there's someone who says, I'd love to benefit from theological resources, but I just get overwhelmed. Like the books that I see on the shelf, like, I don't want to read those. I don't want to open those. So where do I start? And I think that my recommendation would be to probably start with some of those creeds, some of those documents that are time tested, that are proven to be solid anchors. we can get into debates about a lot of things, but that's the things that are outlined in the creeds about who God is, who the Trinity is, and who the church is. Those are things that are really, really solid. And we teach our kids the creeds, particularly the Apostles' Creed, that reflects a early Roman baptismal creed from the 1st, 2nd century, with its roots very close to the apostolic period. And it's just great. It's been the source of awesome conversations about who God is and such. So that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I was going to mention the Apostles' Creed as well, just to name one very specific one that can be looked at. Just Google it. You could find a version online free, easy. And it's very concise, and it reads more like a story than some of the other formulas in early creeds do. And that way it becomes very foundational and formative, because you can talk about a lot from just a couple of words there in the Apostles' Creed. Yeah.
I've actually done some training where I suggested that you could use the Apostles' Creed really well in evangelism, because it outlines, just like you said, it's not theoretical ideas about God. It's not questions of, it's not speculating philosophically about who God is. It's telling the story of God. And really that's what the gospel is too. It's the story of God reaching out to the lost, to sinners, to absolutely people who can't do anything for themselves, and drawing them near to himself through Jesus and in the power of the Spirit. And that's what the Apostles' Creed preserves, and that's an amazing anchor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when those were written, they were written to combat heresies and wrong truths that people were saying, but at the same time, they had a reflexive nature back into the life of the church that said, no, this is what we believe. This is worth following, and saying other things fall outside of that to protect not ourselves, but to protect the very gospel itself. And how we live that out and play it out in the world. So in that way, it falls in line. There's a huge resurgence. It seems like there's been a lot of books written very recently on the Apostles' Creed. So if you do a search, there's one.
My favorite one is by Michael Bird. Now I can't think of what it is. I think it's called What Christians Believe or something like that. I'll link it in the show notes. Yeah. It's a really, really good one. Alister McGrath also has one called I Believe on the Apostles' Creed that's also concise and really easy to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a third one that if I think of what it is, I'll also throw that one in the show notes. I want to say it's from, I'm not exactly sure, from a North American theologian, I believe, but we'll have to look into it. So it falls in line with the Apostles' Creed having a resurgence for a very good reason, because it actually is useful for talking about some in-depth matters in a very concrete way. But even if we take a huge step back and we say, how can young people benefit from resources if they feel like education isn't for them? We also should recognize that not everyone should formally study theology. And by formally, I mean go to an institution, a university, and get an actual degree. But we all are already always learning.
Yep.
We're all being shaped and formed by culture, by everything, whether we like it or not. So in that aspect, studying theology becomes very important for everybody. It's just a matter of what level do we study it on. And for everybody, those watching on YouTube, some of these huge books behind us, New Dictionary of Biblical Theology is like almost 1,000 pages long, I think. So some of those are not quite, people just look at them and want to run away. Which it actually is a very, very good text, well recommended. I've read at least 80% of it myself.
Yeah, same.
It's very good. In that sense, not everybody needs to, though. Some people need to learn in a different way. And that's where I think the idea of tiered theology comes in that we've talked about before. Picturing that pyramid in 3 parts. The smallest at the top are scholars and experts.
Bring out our Trinitarian triangle.
Oh, nice.
I think you used this last time when you used the analogy. So for those watching, I'll illustrate while you talk.
So we're at the top third there, the scholars, the experts. In the middle are church leaders, youth pastors. Some have gone to school beyond a college degree in theology, and others haven't. And that's fine. Not everybody needs that necessarily. In the bottom level, representing the greatest amount or the greatest, if I knew math terms well, like geometrical surface area, whatever, like the greatest area, the most amount of people are going to fall in the bottom.
Yeah.
Normal church-going disciples, normal church people. So if you think about how that works, the more a church leader knows or a youth leader knows, and I'm talking tier 2, the people in the middle, not the top, but the more they know from what the people at the top are saying, then the greater their people in tier 3 at the bottom have the chance to learn and to grow. So like us in the classroom, for our students, the greater our knowledge, the more concise and therefore better we're able to teach. Or at least that's how it should work.
It should. That's right.
Speaking.
That's right. Yeah.
In other words, young people are already benefiting from theological resources. They just don't know that they actually are.
Right. So maybe part of the problem is that we, as those of us who are teaching, don't always show our cards about where we're drawing from. Mm-hmm. And it might present this false image that, we've got it all figured out. And that actually all this came from our heads, which is not true. We are not that smart. We are not that intelligent. And we shouldn't be either. We should be learning about God from the people of God in community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're a leader, tell your people in your ministries where you're getting your information from. It's like everybody likes to name drop famous people that they've met. That's okay. That's fine. But instead, maybe name drop the books, especially some of the ones that are better that people need in your ministries. Name drop those and say, I've learned a lot from this here. And then help them, understand, walk through as necessary. Most people, what everybody's up against is most people are going to go to gotquestions.org or some national website that's like the same type of thing. Or Google or Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Now Google Scholar.
Yeah.
Google Scholar.
Scholar.google.com is an excellent place to start if you have questions. Just plain Google. Maybe it will require a lot of discernment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we can help our people discern if we are saying the sources that are behind when we're using our own preparation when we're teaching. And help them to know what the better ones are from the not as good ones. And even teaching them to read both sides. Like, I don't agree with this book, but it's very good and important to wrestle with the other side, so here you go.
That's right. Yeah. I will say, in defense of Wikipedia as well, similar problem to Google. It requires a lot of discernment, but if you scroll down to the bottom... Resources, there is a bibliography, and that actually often is a good place to start.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I overlooked it, but it's so true, and it works smarter and not harder.
That's right.
Somebody's already done the work. Sift through that work and make your life easier.
Also, a fun tip is often you can get previews of many of these books on Google Books as well. So if you go to books.google.com, you can often get an excerpt and kind of zero in on a section that you're curious about, so you don't have to buy the whole book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe one final passing thought before moving on to the next question. Another way that people can show people how they're actually already doing theology anyway is to simply ask a question. As soon as a question is asked, usually of any kind, it can be taken back to some ultimate or theological thing or topic. And so just helping people to realize, like, theology is just a part of how everything works, and just normalizing and normativizing that in conversations, because it's not something that often happens, and people often look up to the scholars and the others, and you have to know that, and I'm glad because I don't know anything, so I don't have to approach it. But there are ways that can be approached, and just helping people go, that's a really good question that you just asked.
Yeah.
Do you know about this specific area of theology? Because it talks about an answer to this question. Let's talk about that. And so you can introduce categories or concepts to people in a polite way rather than, here's a huge book. Go home and read it. We'll talk about it all next week.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of doing that, unfortunately. But
I have
your
done
point
that, yes.
stands. So
Let's jump into the next question. This one comes from Romania, and special thanks for giving a long description for this. Besides the question itself, truly, thank you for that. It's really, really helpful. So here's the context and the question. In my cultural context in southern Romania, there is an attitude that to put God first means that, quote, work we do for God, church, mission work, ministry, end quote, must be our primary focus. One other attitude here is that rest or Sabbath does not fall into this category of ministry. The result, when combining these two attitudes, and in spite of the fact that one day a week is designated as a Sabbath day, so that's already there, is that Sabbath often just gets ignored or skipped anytime something comes up that's put under the category ministry. So even ignoring obvious issues with the first attitude, how would you respond to someone who says Sabbath isn't ministry?
Ooh.
This is a difficult question because we must admit that all of us do this.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
yeah,
we're all guilty of this. And we have to also recognize that Jesus did things that can be classified as work on the Sabbath.
That's right. That's right.
So that has to be taken into account, recognized. But at the same time, it's a rest day, and it really needs to happen so that bodies can be recharged, so that we can sort of, sync up with the cloud like our phones do, but sync up with God instead through our resting.
Yeah.
So we'll be able to rest. Some people think it's my rest day, but I really need to finish this or do that for this person in my ministry. So I'll be able to rest better if I just finish this one thing up right now on my rest day, on the Sabbath, before I rest. Right?
Yeah.
I've done this.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's valid. I think most of the time it's probably not. It could wait for 24 hours.
My wife is very good at asking probing questions to discern in those situations, is it really that important to do this right now or not? So, but it's a good question. Can I go to a text?
Do it.
Okay. So, when Jesus starts his ministry in the Gospel of Mark, immediately some of the first things he starts dealing with is questions around Sabbath. And there's these two contrasting stories that can, I think, help zero in on how do we approach this kind of a question. So, so the first is at the end of chapter 2 of Mark chapter 2. And this is more of a question of like, can I do things, on my rest day? And what, is that acceptable? And why don't I just read it? So on the Sabbath day, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, Jesus, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave some to his companions." Then he told them the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So then the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So on the one hand, there's this story of them doing work, but it's actually work that is nourishing. They're walking through the fields and picking grain, and so clearly the point is not, protecting the Sabbath for the sake of the Sabbath. The point is protecting the Sabbath for the sake of us.
Yeah.
And that's why Jesus says Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. On the other hand, there's this story right next to it, beginning of chapter 3. Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. Ooh, we're going to catch Jesus.
Many times this happens.
Oh my gosh. Yes. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us." Then he said to them, "All right, everybody." Paraphrasing. "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" Trick question. But they were silent. That's a hard question to answer. Obviously to do good, obviously to save life, and yet. So after looking around at them with anger, which is really interesting, he gets angry at them for not getting it. He was grieved at their hardness of hearts and told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out and his hand was restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started plotting against him, and they were going to kill him. It's like the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and he's already having issues with this.
Yeah.
But the point of, I think, this story is to remind us that that Sabbath is all about healing. Sabbath is all about life and renewal. And so if the Sabbath is not doing that, then it's not meeting its purpose. So to the point of, back to the question, is the Sabbath does the Sabbath count as ministry? No, because there's more to life than ministry. It's about joining up with God and what he's doing and bringing restoration to our lives and to the world. And we ought to honor God as king in what he's doing to bring restoration by submitting ourselves to that and by trusting that, you know what, the world is not going to collapse if I take a day off. And it's actually good to do that. God wants life for me, and I need to receive that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in that passage. It was in the back of my head as I was starting to formulate discussing this question, and I thought, do I bring it in? Do I not? So you've gone into my head, you retrieved it and pulled out scripture. So amazing. And yes, and I think also at the same time we could argue, is Sabbath ministry? I think it's a type of ministry. I would argue it's a type of ministry, but the point of Sabbath is to actually hard pause from what's going on, but it's actually part of the overall cycle. We see that in the year of the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, where people rested, slaves were set free, the land was given a year off so that it would the soil would become rich again to be able to have a higher yield, better crops, so on and so forth. So in that way, it's part of a broader life rhythm that God created, and I think it's because in the beginning, right? But really, we see that everything God does is holy, but when God rests, that there specifically that word is officially brought in. And so in starting with Genesis 1 and 2, the only day that explicitly says that God made holy was the seventh day.
Yeah, I'll just read Genesis 2:3. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. And some translations, maybe even in your native tongue translations, might translate the seventh day as the Sabbath. So God blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation.
Yeah, and so that I think becomes part of that's part of the rhythm of God in a way. That's being established and set forth for us. So if the seventh day was made holy because God rested from the work of his hands, this provides the model which is cited all over the rest of Scripture and why Jesus is dealing with it at the very beginning of his ministry. That explains why that's happening in talking about man honoring the Sabbath. So there, much more, I think, can be said. We could walk through in coming episodes, we're going to talk about the idea of biblical theology and explain what that is and how to do it and actually walk through it. We could do that specifically with Sabbath, with rest, which we've done some. But maybe over the course of time we'll keep developing more. In moving more to the New Testament, though, again to the New Testament, because we've already discussed Mark, I think it's notable that the disciples were doing what they were told after Jesus ascended.
Yeah.
Jesus said, such a paradox, right?
Ooh.
Go there
and wait.
Just like he says in Mark 6. He says it a lot. It's like, Jesus, we did awesome things that you said was going to happen. Can you believe that? A normal ministry leader, whoa, willing worker, go do more. Go do more. Go get it done. Jesus, come away with me and let's rest a while.
Ooh. Yeah.
So even after the ascension, Jesus says, go there and wait. Of course, because the Spirit hasn't yet come in fullness. Go there and wait. That's in Acts 1:4. There's a huge flurry of God working in the Old Testament creation account, and then he rests and enters life with his people, which gets messed up, of course, because of Adam and Eve. There's a huge flurry of activity by God. We see the same thing in the start of the church, the huge flurry of activity, the gospel work of Christ, and then a huge pregnant pause as Jesus is about to rest at the right hand of the Father, and the Spirit then enter fully into his people in a very new, amazing way. And I think we even have to go one step further. Luke 4, Jesus tells those in the synagogue that he's reading about himself from the scroll of Isaiah. He says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Again, in Israel, that Jubilee year was a hard stop of rest, of work, and the land to recover from making, grains and things. So Jesus proclaims this is everlasting because of his work.
That's right.
No longer every so often, but every day as a living reality that's ours.
And the crazy thing is that we take that as like, oh, great. So now that we live in the eternal Sabbath, thanks to Jesus, now we do like have received rest and freedom and things like that. Then that means that we don't have to keep the rhythms anymore. Mm-hmm. Which I don't think is really the point. The point is not to say, great, thanks Jesus. Now that you did that, now we just work every day. That's definitely not the point.
Probably not. Yeah. So again, how would you respond to someone who says Sabbath isn't ministry? That's a long-winded answer for saying Sabbath can be a type of ministry, personal rest and reflection with God, but also a pausing from work. And we see that it's modeled by God, like literally in human form in the person of Christ. Mm-hmm. So Sabbath and rest are literally built into the very fabric and framework of God, which is why we are supposed to model that. So there's at least two other ways I think that we could answer or maybe discuss this question. One more practical, the other is more Trinitarian related. The more practical discussion of this answer leads to questions or discussions of things like burnout.
Yeah.
So Tyler, tell us about what's happening when we are doing Sabbath and what that's actually doing for the rest of our ministry.
Well, it's doing a lot for us personally and for our ministry. And just very practically, Sabbath can calm us. It can reset us. It can recharge us, can rejuvenate us, give us kind of new life and new perspective into ministry. It can allow us to live in a not just a reactionary way, but actually, be able to look at the bigger picture and take that into account and make wise decisions. And it also, for those of us who are married, who have kids, then it models. I mean, it keeps our families healthy, which is no small thing. And yeah, so the burnout piece is a really, really big one that should not be taken lightly. And there have been lots of studies recently on burnout and in ministry in particular, and how common it actually is. So this discussion is not new, but needs to be happening more.
Yeah, and I just ran across some of the more peripheral parts of that research you're mentioning in an article that we'll link in the show notes. It talks about how the Japanese actually had to create a word I'm going to not say this right, but karoshi. And it literally means overwork related death. So death related to overworking, karoshi. And also karojiatsu is a word that is designated for suicides that are related to overwork and work-related stress.
Man.
The Japanese, it's such a problem that they've had to create words for that. It's a tragic reality. And just in case anybody's wondering, the article cites about 60 hours a week is the average in Japan. Just in case anybody was wondering, about 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
Perhaps more, perhaps a little bit less. But they've created these terms, which is crazy. And there's also something called the Maslach Burnout Inventory that measures 3 major areas of burnout. It's mentioned in this article as well. 3 of those things are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. So emphasizing personal accomplishments, depersonalizing other people and other people's problems, and then just being emotionally exhausted and drained all the time. So rest is able to reset our minds and our bodies to a slower rhythm that's healthy, and allow us to look around and say with God, oh, your creation is good. And sometimes if we get so busy, we don't see the beauty and we miss it. And God is not always working so fast as to be able to stop at the end of each day and go, this is good. And behold, man, this is very good. In spending and wanting to have that relational connection in that way. Yeah, we could go on for a long time. We're going to have to probably close that question here, but there's a really fun connection back into the life of the Trinity, and the word mission actually comes from Trinitarian theology. So
in that sense, Sabbath is mission is related to ministry to mission.
It could be argued that, yeah, because it's part of who God is, how theology has been conceived. And so our Trinitarian God rested and enjoyed it. called it good and holy and set it apart.
Yeah.
And in that way we are to do the same thing.
It's great.
So one final question. This one comes from Montenegro. There's actually 2 questions. We'll just take, I think, the last one for the sake of our time. So
we're going to do this lightning round.
Yes.
Try to be more concise, which is always a challenge for the theologically inclined.
It's true. I also can't find the second question at the moment.
I think I have it.
You have it?
What are some other ways we can teach kids the importance of theology?
Yes.
And how can they learn it personally from a young age? Well, this question is from
Montenegro.
That's a great question. We've already touched on some of these things in our answer to our lovely Bulgarian's question. I think that we can just prioritize God speak. That's God speak and God acts is a part of the family, and that's if you go back to I think it's in Deuteronomy now. I can't remember exactly where. Oh no, I do remember. I could find it. I'm speaking off the cuff now. But anyway, one of the things that God tells Israel as a part of developing their new covenant identity as the people of God, it's connected right after to God saying that to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your strength. And then he tells parents to talk about God in everyday life, in situations, and to just bring God into everyday things. And he also says to write the things of God on the doorposts and bind it to your hand and your forehead. And that's just a way of saying, like, put physical reminders of God and his truth and his character in your life. And so it's not just God speak, but it's also God acts, and it's God symbols as well. And so living a fully kind of integrated life can just be massive for passing on the faith. And I just ordered a book actually about this, what it means to pass on the faith to new generations, that I'm excited to dig into, but I have not yet. So,
yeah. And I have thoughts on that question, but I'm going to pause myself. And instead, I'm just very quickly going to touch on the second question from same person in Montenegro. Do your habits of missional rest change from season to season, or is it healthier to keep them consistent no matter your constantly changing schedule? I think that's a great question. And just to give a very fast response, I always reevaluate everything in 3-month cycles. So about 4 times a year. My language learning, is what I'm doing actually working for learning the Czech language? And if not, I adjust, because it's very important. And so if in certain seasons are going to be busier, having to say, okay, that's true, but then going very quickly and saying, where is my planned rest? It's going to look different. That's okay. I'll get back to what I want to do in the next season. But right now, how do I prioritize rest? It's going to look different, so I have to recognize that, but how can I build that in? Mm-hmm. And I think one easy way, and something that can always remain constant, is putting something on a calendar. So every week, Saturday, I have nothing on my calendar. Some people, you could just literally block off Sabbath, rest.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then once every quarter, something that my family is working on doing is building in a rhythm once a quarter of something like a long weekend where we're resting a little bit longer than just one day. And it's on our calendar so that everything else is just planned around it. So even in busy seasons, that's possible, but we have to start with actually putting rest on a calendar first. So
that's great. That's some great advice. I think that's super useful, super practical.
Yeah. We would love to continue talking about this. We'll keep these themes going in coming episodes. Thank you for listening to this one. An honor, a privilege to be in discussion with you. Thank you for your questions. We deeply appreciate you for giving your time in listening to us. And we pray that the words of our mouths will be faithful to Scripture and a blessing, encouragement, and a challenge to you. And with that, we say, go now in peace and in the authority given to you by Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.